Minister, first of all, I welcome this legislation. I think it's very positive that we're debating it here. And I think the one thing that we should set as a benchmark here in this country is that no child should ever go to bed hungry. And look, the reality is that no child is ever going to reach their full potential if they're sitting at a school desk hungry. Yet, according to the state agency Safe Food, 10% of our population here in Ireland live in food poverty. So, as a food-producing country, as a major food exporter, we're dumping nearly 2 tonnes of food every single minute. Where in fact, as a country, we dump over 1 million tonnes of food every single year. And, and that's not including what's coming from the agriculture sector. And it's estimated that households here in Ireland throw away 1/3 of the food that they actually purchase in the supermarket. And, there's something fundamentally wrong in a system and a country where we're dumping so much food, and yet we have so many people going hungry. We have so many children going hungry. And in fact, the average annual cost of the food that Irish homes dump every year is €750, a substantial amount of money. And look, there are initiatives out there to try and encourage people to plan their meals and to plan their shopping, to better use their leftovers, to dispose of food ultimately correctly. But one of the biggest problems that we have as a country is actually getting people to understand the difference between use by and best before. And a huge amount of food is dumped out every year because of that very simple misunderstanding. And the one thing that I would encourage people to do is to actually look into their bin, see what they're actually throwing out, particularly to see what they are throwing into their bin that has remained unopened or unused. Because half of all the food that is dumped in Irish households is unopened or unused. And I think if we could even do that much, it would be of huge benefit in terms of reducing food waste, in terms of reducing emissions, as well as saving families a substantial amount of money. I know when I supported the whole issue of food waste as Minister, we developed an initiative in County Roscommon with Roscommon County Council, where we went around to hotels and restaurants, working directly with them, looking at the profile of the food that they were actually dumping. And restaurants and hotels in County Roscommon were able to reduce their food costs by 30% on average by doing that process and actually monitoring it. And that's a substantial saving, particularly in an industry where margins are so tight. And in fact, I was in the restaurant next door to my own office a couple of weeks ago, the Peppermill restaurant. And they have a sign at the till where when you're buying your breakfast, they don't automatically give you toast. You have to ask for the toast. And it's not because they don't want to give people toast. But I actually asked the manager, and he told me they were dumping buckets of bread every single day where they were automatically giving toast to people which wasn't being used. And by actually looking and seeing at what was actually going out in their food bin every day, they changed and altered the restaurant menu to reflect that. And I think all of us, as individuals, as families and as businesses, need to look at that. Now, the reality is, look, there's a certain amount of food that is unavoidably going to go to waste, whether it be skins or whatever it is. But there is an inherent source of energy, of nutrition, of economic value in that waste. And the last place, the very last place that should be going is into landfill. And that's why, when I was Minister, we took the decision to roll out brown bins on a phased basis to every single home in Ireland. And I was disappointed to hear from colleagues earlier that in some instances people had to go and seek that brown bin, because it should be available to people now. The objective is to try and gather up that waste resource and reuse it in terms of generating biogas and the residual being used as fertiliser, which is now, today, a very valuable resource, particularly within the agricultural community. And speaking of a resource, and it is a resource, that food waste, but it also has a huge impact in terms of our climate emissions. Because, you know, the discussion in relation to climate change has very much focused on energy generation, on how we choose to travel, how we choose to heat our homes. However, food has a substantial climate impact. And in fact, the carbon footprint of the wasted food globally is estimated to be 3.3 gigatons. In fact, if food waste was a country, it would rank only behind the United States and China in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And what is hugely frustrating when you talk about the issue of poverty is that there is enough food being produced in the world today to feed the populations. But because of our wastefulness, because of our inefficiency, people still go hungry, and people still go hungry in Ireland today. And, you know, we talk about food security, and it's a big topical issue at the moment. It is a huge environmental and economic imperative that we actually address this, and Ireland has the opportunity to be a global leader in relation to how we dramatically reduce food waste and how we manage the waste that is being generated in a far more responsible manner. But it's not just in terms of the issue of food waste. I think, yes, because we're a food-producing country, it is probably the single biggest natural resource that we have here. But all of our natural resources need to be managed in a far more responsible way and ensure that, you know, we manage those resources to protect our planet. And I think the one thing that has probably come out of the COVID pandemic and the crisis that we're seeing now as a result of war in the Ukraine is that it will hopefully bring about a very different economic model. The economic model up to now has been very much a global economic model, where you produce one part of a product in one part of the world and then add value to it in another part of the world. I think we all need to look at how we can live within our own resources, within our own countries and within our own communities, rather than relying on imports and resources from another part of the world, which may be having a detrimental economic impact and environmental impact in some other part of the world. And I think, you know, technologists, scientists, engineers have a huge role to play in actually how they design these products, to design them in the most economical terms possible and minimising the use of natural resources and also minimising the use of the amount of energy that's used to produce the product in the first place, or in terms of the consumption of energy over the lifespan of that particular product. And when we design the manufacturing process, we have to design it in such a way that it generates as little pollution as possible, not just at the time of its manufacture, but during its lifetime and in terms of its end of life disposal. And you know, that whole life cycle of a product needs to change, because you know, priority needs to be given first of all to repairing a product. And you know, one of the things that people would say is, well, look, it's all well and good talking about repairing something, but where do you actually go and do that? We have seen over the last 20, 30, 40 years those skill sets disappearing, where you know, we had people who could repair products. There was a tradition and a culture there in Ireland in relation to that. If we go to Africa or Asia, we see it on a regular basis, people repurposing things, repairing things, rather than actually buying something new. And I recall that Roscommon County Council a number of years ago produced a booklet of different businesses around the county that were involved in the whole repair sector, whether it was repairing clothes, repairing bicycles or phones, so that you knew where you could get your shoes repaired, where you could get your phone repaired. And I know that that developed into a nationwide initiative, and the website repairmystuff.ie, where you can log on online and see if you need your washing machine repaired or your radio repaired, where you can actually get that done. And in fact now, in relation to some heavy goods like furniture, people actually call to your home and carry out those repairs in your home, rather than you actually having to actually transport that. And that's creating jobs within our own local communities, creating jobs within our own economy, rather than importing a new suite of furniture from the other side of the world, or a new radio from some other part of the world, where there's been a huge amount of natural resources and energy used to create that product in the first place. Secondly, we need to ensure that we actually reuse products more and more. And again, this comes back to scientists and engineers in actually how the product is designed. That instead of designing the latest mobile phone, that after 2 years the battery begins to wear out and you have to replace it, we should be designing products in such a way that if the battery goes, that you replace the battery, not the whole mobile phone. And there needs to be a legal responsibility on the manufacturers of products to extend the lifespan of a product, rather than having it just for 2 years, then you dump it and buy a new phone or a new washing machine, or whatever the case may be. And it needs to be built in at the concept, at the design stage of that particular product. And then thirdly, the last option should be to recycle. And sadly at the moment there is this perception among society that it's a good thing to recycle. Absolutely, it's far better to recycle a product than to actually dump it in a bin that ends up either in landfill or incineration. But recycling is not the solution. We should be ensuring, insofar as is possible, that we minimise the amount of products that we actually put into the recycling bin, that we actually maximise the reuse of individual products, and only at the end of that process do we actually put it into recycling. Because when we recycle a product, a huge amount of energy has to be put into that product to repurpose it again, even if it's glass bottles, which can be recycled generation after generation after generation. A huge amount of energy needs to be put into that bottle to actually bring it onto the supermarket shelf again. The same in relation to plastics, and of course there's a finite lifespan to a particular plastic bottle, it cannot be continually recycled and recycled and recycled. It has a specific lifespan. And just on that issue, I think, we're talking about a circular economy strategy that looks at all these big weighty plans that are out there in terms of the Waste Action Plan, in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But I also think something very, very basic needs to be included in the thinking of every single product that is produced and put onto the market in the first place. And they're the 7 principles of universal design. That we look at anything that we design in such a way that it can be used by the maximum number of people possible. So, for example, when the genius that designed a scissors came up with it, it's great if you're right-handed, but if you're Kithog, it's not much good to you. So you actually have to get a specific scissors. How and why did we not design a scissors that could have universal use? And it is possible, very simply, to design a scissors to do that. Again, in terms of a seatbelt, obviously it was a man that designed a seatbelt, because I don't think any woman would have designed a seatbelt in the way that they are designed. But we need to think about everyone in society when we're designing a product. People of ranging abilities, whether they be physical abilities or other capacities, that they're taken into account and consideration when we design a product in the first place, and that we take that into account at the start of that process, not down the road when we have generated a huge amount of waste as a result of something that can only be used by a small proportion of our population. And again, I think society, science, technology, engineering has a vital role to play in eliminating the generation of a lot of these wastes in the first place and reducing our overall climate emissions. And I recall when I was Minister for Climate Action, we established the Climate Action Fund. Specifically, that fund was established to drive innovation, specifically innovation here in Ireland to deal with the unique climate challenges that we have here, design unique solutions for that. Sadly, very little funding to date has gone into that particular aspect of climate change, but hopefully we will see that fund driving the type of radical innovation that we need to deal with the unique climate challenges that we have here, and not try and take a continental European solution and shoehorn it into an Irish model. And to give you a practical example of what we're talking about in relation to that, we often hear that the solution to our transport emissions in Ireland are public transport. And where you have a densely populated country like we have in continental Europe, yes, that will solve the problem. In our cities, it will solve the problem here. But when you have 37% of your population living in isolated rural communities, that's not going to solve the problem. Now, some of the environmental geniuses say, well, we need to shove everyone that's living in rural Ireland into towns, and that will solve the problem. That will be many, many, many generations down the road, long after we've dealt with the climate crisis that we have at the moment. But delivering broadband, so people don't have to sit into their car in the first place, actually does provide a practical solution. And broadband has a far more significant climate impact here than anywhere else, probably globally. So what I'm saying is, let's look at our unique challenges and let's design unique solutions to that. And I think we can be a global leader in relation to it. I think we also need to ensure that we ban plastics that there are alternatives available for. Not talking about taxing them. If there's an alternative, they should be banned outright. And secondly, then tax those plastics where we don't have today a practical alternative available. And one of those particular plastics, probably the single biggest problem microplastic that we have globally, is cigarette butts. Every single cigarette butt has 12,000 strands of plastic. that are going into our watercourses, going into our rivers, into our oceans, being consumed by our fish, and ultimately we ourselves are consuming that. That's one thing that we need to address, and address urgently. Good.